3 days after my neighbor sent me a $15,000 bill for a fence I never asked them to build, they were standing in the dark, staring through 40 feet of expensive glass that reflected nothing but their own panic. And if you'd told me a week earlier that was how this whole mess would end, I probably would have laughed, poured another cup of coffee, and gone back to fixing my old cedar posts. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 62, retired after 35 years designing electrical distribution systems across the Pacific Northwest, and these days my biggest concern is usually whether my sheep have figured out another creative way to escape the pasture. I inherited 150 acres outside a quiet farming town in eastern Washington, the same land my grandparents worked long before fancy vacation homes started showing up in the valley. My grandfather built every section of our cedar fence with his own hands. He cut the trees himself, shaped every post with simple tools, and stretched wire one careful section at a time because, as he used to tell me, a fence isn't there to keep people out, Danny. It's there to remind everyone where respect begins. I didn't fully understand that sentence until years later. The house itself wasn't impressive by magazine standards. It creaked in winter, the porch leaned just enough to make visitors nervous, and every spring I promised myself I'd repaint it before finding some excuse not to. But it was home. It smelled like old pine boards, leather gloves, coffee that stayed on the burner too long, and the faint scent of diesel from the tractor that had somehow become permanent. Across the property line stood something entirely different. The Ashcroft estate looked like it had been lifted out of an architecture magazine and dropped into cattle country by accident. Walls of imported glass reflected the mountains all day. Heated stone patios wrapped around an infinity pool that glowed blue even after midnight. Landscapers seemed to appear every Tuesday with matching trucks, matching uniforms, and matching smiles that disappeared the second they noticed me watching from my side of the fence. Owen Ashcroft owned the place. Mid-50s, founder of a software company he'd sold for more money than I could honestly imagine. His wife, Vanessa, designed luxury interiors for celebrities somewhere in California. They entertained guests almost every weekend. Expensive cars rolled through the gate. Caterers came and went. Drone photographers circled overhead. Yet in nearly 4 years of being neighbors, the closest Owen ever came to greeting me was a brief nod that looked more like he was acknowledging an inconvenient mailbox than another human being. That suited me just fine. I wasn't looking for friendship. I only expected the same thing my grandfather had always expected from neighbors. Stay on your land, I'll stay on mine, and we'll both sleep better because of it. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning. I'd grabbed my fence pliers, tossed a few staples into my pocket, and walked out to replace a section where one stubborn ram had decided the grass looked greener on the other side. About halfway down the eastern boundary, something felt wrong before I could even explain why. The birds weren't sitting on the fence. There wasn't any fence left for them to sit on. Nearly 200 feet of weathered cedar had vanished. In its place stood towering sheets of frameless glass, polished so perfectly they almost disappeared against the sky. For a second I honestly wondered if I'd walked onto the wrong property. Then I spotted one of my grandfather's old cedar posts lying in a pile beyond the new glass wall, split clean down the middle like it had been tossed aside without a second thought. My stomach dropped. I stepped closer until I noticed something else waiting for me. A thick, cream-colored envelope had been fastened to my gate with a plastic zip tie. My name was printed across the front in elegant black lettering. Inside sat a heavy invoice on expensive paper. Fence enhancement services. Balance due, $15,000. Payment requested within 30 days. I read it twice because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. They had removed my family's fence, installed a luxury glass wall that improved the view from their pool, then billed me for the privilege. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes the human mind doesn't know what else to do when something becomes that ridiculous. About 10 minutes later, my old friend Hank drove by hauling a flatbed trailer loaded with hay. He slowed when he saw me standing there holding the invoice. Everything all right, he called through the open window. I held up the paper. Apparently, I owe my neighbor 15 grand for stealing my own fence. Hank stared at me for several seconds before climbing out of the truck. We walked the boundary together without saying much. Finally, he muttered, "Well, that's either the dumbest thing I've ever seen, or the beginning of the most expensive mistake somebody around here's ever made." I folded the invoice, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it under my arm. Anger would have been the easy reaction. Marching next door would have been satisfying for maybe 30 seconds. But after spending decades solving electrical failures, I'd learned one lesson that served me better than a temper ever could. When something doesn't make sense, stop talking, start looking. By noon, I was sitting across from my attorney, a patient old property lawyer named Richard Cole, who listened without interrupting while I spread photographs, survey maps, and the ridiculous invoice across his conference table. He didn't comment on the bill. He barely looked at the pictures. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, tapped one finger against the desk, and asked a question so ordinary it almost sounded unrelated. "Daniel, have you ever looked at where their utility lines actually run?" I blinked. "No. Why would I?" Richard smiled, the kind of smile lawyers get when they already know the answer to a question you haven't even thought to ask yet. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "the most valuable thing on a piece of property isn't what you can see above the ground." Richard's question stayed with me the entire drive home. I knew every fence post on that property, every drainage ditch, every old oak tree that had somehow survived a dozen windstorms. But if someone had asked me where the Ashcroft's electrical service entered their estate, I couldn't have answered. That bothered me. The engineer in me hated not knowing how something worked. The next morning, I drove to the county records office, where an elderly clerk named Martha recognized me before I even reached the counter. We'd crossed paths years earlier whenever I needed archived survey maps for one project or another. She smiled, slid a pair of reading glasses onto her nose, and asked what I was looking for. "Utility easements," I said. "Everything connected to the Ashcroft property." She disappeared into the records room and returned carrying several oversized map books along with digital files she'd already pulled onto a computer terminal. We spent nearly 2 hours tracing parcel boundaries, subdivision records, utility permits, and historical surveys dating back almost 40 years. At first, nothing seemed unusual, then one detail caught my eye. The primary three-phase electrical feeder serving the Ashcroft estate crossed nearly 3/4 of a mile through my property before reaching the transformer behind their garage. Water followed the same route. Fiber optic cables sat inside the same corridor. Even the underground propane supply crossed my southern pasture before turning toward their mechanical building. I kept searching for the easement documentation that legally allowed those lines to exist. There wasn't one. We searched another hour. Nothing. Martha finally leaned back and folded her hands. "Looks like the subdivision plans assumed somebody would file the paperwork later." "Did they?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not that I can find." I thanked her, copied every document, and left with a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. On the drive home, I wasn't celebrating. I was thinking, there's a difference. Because discovering leverage and deciding to use it are two completely different things. That evening, I walked the property again, stopping beside what remained of my grandfather's fence. I ran my hand across one of the old cedar posts they'd tossed into a brush pile like construction debris. I remembered helping Grandpa replace broken staples when I was maybe 10 years old. He never rushed. Every repair mattered because somebody before him had built it with care. Looking at those splintered boards, something inside me settled. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about respect. The following morning, I hired a licensed survey crew. 3 trucks rolled onto the property just after sunrise. Bright orange flags appeared every few yards while laser equipment quietly measured every inch of the boundary. Around lunchtime, Owen finally noticed. He drove over in a spotless black SUV and stepped out wearing expensive hiking boots that looked like they'd never touched actual dirt before. "What's all this?" he asked. I nodded toward the surveyors. "Just confirming where my land ends." He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Seems unnecessary." "Funny," I replied. "So did replacing my fence." His expression hardened. That old fence was falling apart. We upgraded the view for both properties. I pulled the folded invoice from my jacket pocket. "Then maybe you can explain why I got billed for your generosity." He barely glanced at it. "My project manager handles those details." "Well," I said calmly, "he also built 4 inches onto my land." Owen laughed. Actually laughed. "4 inches? You're serious?" "Dead serious." He shrugged. "If that's the biggest problem you've got, I'd say you're doing all right." Then he climbed back into the SUV and drove away before I answered. By late afternoon, the survey crew handed me their certified report. The glass wall wasn't just close to the boundary. It crossed it in multiple locations, with the maximum encroachment measuring just over 4 inches. Legally, that mattered far more than most people realized. Richard drafted 2 certified letters before sunset. One demanded removal of every structure crossing the property line. The second addressed the undocumented utility corridor. It gave the Ashcrofts 72 hours to begin negotiating formal easement agreements before I exercised my rights as the landowner. We mailed both letters that evening. I slept better than I had in days. Not because I expected them to cooperate, but because everything from that point forward would be documented. 24 hours later, my phone rang. Owen didn't bother saying hello. Are you actually threatening to shut off utilities? I'm offering to legalize something that should have been handled decades ago. That's absurd. No, I answered, sending someone a $15,000 invoice after tearing down his family fence. That was absurd. Silence. Then he spoke again, slower this time. My attorneys will deal with this. I'm sure they'll try. You'll regret this. I looked across the pasture where my sheep wandered peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. Maybe, I said. But if nothing changes, you'll have a very expensive house with no legal access to electricity, water, internet, or propane. I'd be more concerned about that than about me. I ended the call before he could respond. The next morning, an unfamiliar sedan rolled into my driveway. 2 attorneys climbed out carrying leather briefcases. They introduced themselves politely enough and suggested there had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. That's lawyer language for someone realizing the facts aren't on their side. Richard joined us 15 minutes later. We spread survey maps across my kitchen table, right beside a pie my neighbor Carol had dropped off earlier that morning because she'd heard there was some excitement down the road. Nobody touched the pie. One attorney argued that the utilities had existed for decades and should therefore remain undisturbed. Richard simply asked for the recorded easement number. Neither attorney answered. Instead, they changed the subject to community cooperation. Richard smiled politely. Community cooperation usually starts before one neighbor removes another neighbor's fence. The meeting lasted less than an hour. They left with copies of every survey, every photograph, and every county record we'd uncovered. That afternoon, I hired an excavation contractor to expose sections of the underground utility corridor without damaging any infrastructure. We weren't disconnecting anything. We were documenting exactly where everything lay beneath my land. The contractor parked 2 excavators near the access road just before sunset. Somehow, word traveled faster than machinery. Less than 40 minutes later, Owen's attorney called again, this time sounding noticeably less confident. Surely we can avoid escalating this. I glanced toward the excavators silhouetted against the fading sky. I've been trying to avoid escalation since the day your client tore down my fence. What exactly do you want? He asked. I looked at the old cedar post leaning against my barn wall, weathered by decades of rain and snow, yet still standing. Tell your client we'll discuss that after the 72 hours expire. I hung up, and for the first time since finding that ridiculous invoice tied to my gate, I realized the balance of power had shifted completely. They still had the money, but I had something money couldn't buy overnight, and by the time Owen finally understood that, the clock was almost out. The 72-hour deadline expired at exactly 9 o'clock Monday morning. I wasn't standing in a courtroom, I wasn't yelling across a fence, and I certainly wasn't celebrating. I was sitting on my porch with a cup of black coffee, watching a light fog drift across the pasture while my dog slept beside my boots. Sometimes the biggest moments in life arrive so quietly you'd miss them if you weren't paying attention. At 9:15, Richard called. No agreement, he said. Their attorneys are asking for more time. Did they make an offer? I asked. No. Then time isn't what they're after. I thanked him, finished my coffee, and drove to meet the excavation crew. Everything we did that morning had already been reviewed by attorneys and approved through the proper notices. Nobody touched a single energized cable. Nobody damaged a pipe. The crew simply exposed enough of the underground corridor to establish access points and document every utility crossing my property. It was remarkable how quickly confidence disappears when paperwork replaces assumptions. Around noon, another convoy of black SUVs rolled onto the county road. Owen stepped out before the vehicles had even stopped rolling. Gone was the relaxed smile I'd grown used to seeing from across the fence. His face looked pale, his shirt sleeves were rolled up, and for the first time since we'd become neighbors, he looked like a man who hadn't slept. This has gone far enough, he he said. I agree. Then call your people off. I shook my head. You first. He stared at the trench where brightly colored utility markings disappeared beneath my pasture. You're really willing to leave my family without power? No, I answered calmly. I'm willing to protect property rights that should have been respected from the beginning. Over a fence, he snapped. I looked him straight in the eye. No. Over the decision you made when you believed my property didn't matter because yours looked more expensive. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I reached into my truck and handed him a neatly organized folder. He opened it, expecting another legal notice. Instead, he found a formal proposal. A professionally drafted 50-year utility easement with compensation calculated by an independent land appraiser, annual maintenance provisions, inspection rights, restoration requirements for any future excavation, and one additional page listing every cost his actions had created. Replacement of the original cedar fence using premium old-growth timber. Certified survey expenses. Legal fees. Property restoration. Total compensation just under $900,000. Owen flipped through the pages without saying anything. When he finally looked up, all the confidence had disappeared. You're asking nearly $1 million. Richard, who had quietly walked over beside me, answered before I could. Actually, we're offering certainty. The alternative is applying for entirely new utility corridors through neighboring properties that have already indicated they're unwilling to grant access. Environmental review alone could take years. Owen closed the folder. You'll never get this. Richard simply smiled. Perhaps not. But your lender may have questions once they learn the primary utilities serving an $8 million residence have no recorded legal easement. That landed exactly where Richard intended. Wealthy people understand risk, especially financial risk. By Wednesday afternoon, the phone calls had changed completely. Nobody was making threats anymore. They were asking questions. Could certain provisions be modified? Could the inspection radius be reduced? Would annual maintenance payments remain fixed? Actual negotiations had finally begun, the kind that should have happened before anyone touched a single cedar post. We settled late Friday evening. The final agreement protected both properties, compensated mine fairly, and guaranteed every future repair would require written notice and my approval. The amount wasn't exactly what Richard's first proposal requested, but it was substantial enough that neither side would ever forget why the agreement existed. More important than the money was one paragraph Owen insisted on writing himself. It wasn't legally required. It simply stated that removing the original fence without permission had been a mistake and acknowledged the history attached to it. A week later, I watched a construction crew carefully remove every glass panel they'd installed. They worked slower taking them down than they'd worked putting them up. Maybe that's what accountability looks like. Over the next month, skilled craftsmen rebuilt my grandfather's fence using hand-finished cedar that looked almost identical to the original. Before they installed the final section, I quietly carried one of Grandpa's surviving posts out of the barn and asked the foreman if they could incorporate it into the corner nearest the old oak tree. It wasn't structurally necessary. It was sentimental. He nodded without asking another question. Sometimes people understand more than they say. As for Owen, we still aren't friends. We probably never will be. But every now and then, when we're both checking our property after a storm, he'll lift a hand and wave. It's a small gesture, but it's genuine. Funny enough, respect finally crossed that fence long after the glass disappeared. The framed invoice still hangs above my coffee maker today. Not because I enjoy remembering the argument, but because it reminds me how easily pride can turn a simple conversation into an expensive lesson. Looking back now, I don't think this story was ever really about money or utility lines or even a fence. It was about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness and assumes silence means surrender. Sometimes the strongest response isn't the loudest one. Sometimes it's knowing exactly where you stand, literally and legally, then having the patience to let the truth do the heavy lifting. So now I'd like to hear from you. Was I justified in standing my ground? Or should I have found a compromise much earlier, even after everything that happened? Have you ever had a neighbor who believed money or influence placed them above everyone else? Share your story down in the comments because I genuinely love to read it. And if you enjoy fictional property disputes and legal drama told like a front porch conversation, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.